Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. We acknowledge First Peoples' custodianship of the country from which we joined this online conference. We pay our respects to the First Nations elders and current descendants of these countries, especially those First Peoples attending this Global Greens Conference. And we especially commit to that part of our work as Greens that is guided and led by Indigenous peoples in redressing past injustice and preserving current Indigenous sovereign stewardship. Dr. Janara, could you give us a cultural introduction and settle us into the session, please?
So everybody, just be nice and quiet in your space. Remember that we're the First Nations sovereign people of this planet, and it's very important that we bring everybody welcome to country, into this place. Welcome from our lands, from your lands, from everyone's lands. I'm going to sing you a song that we sing in our clan, Waka Waka Woolly Woolly, when we welcome everybody together to come and learn the law, the chukapa, about Nura, the land, about Walter, the family, and about how to steward it and look after it and be self-sovereign on country. This is called Garin and Arming. Please just be still and listen and come and be present. Uwa Palya. Garin and Arming, Jujuma Beranu, Garin and Arming, Jujuma Beranu, Garin and Arming, Jujuma Beranu, Gaya Mama Rangu and Jagungum Gayungum, Gaya Mama Rangu and Jagungum Gayungum, Jagungum Gayungum. Garin in the Namin, Jujuma Biranu, Garin in the Namin, Jujuma Biranu, Garin in the Namin, Jujuma Biranu, Gaya Mama Rangu, and Jagungum Gayungum, Jagungum Gayungum, Jagungum Gayungum. Go! We welcome you all to come and walk with us and learn from the speakers today. And we learn with you as we walk with you. Ua Palya.
Thank you, Dr. Janara. So for our participants, we're all obviously aware that the topic for our online conference is Connecting for Green Action. And we are hoping that through this session and from listening to our speakers and from those interactions that you've already had in some of the other sessions and will have in the sessions to come over this great 24 hours of green partnership across the globe, that you will hear other stories that will give momentum to what we want to achieve from this session. And basically, Connecting for Green Action, the action we want to get out of this session is to restart the Indigenous Global Greens Network. It was started some years ago by Kellyanne and the Taiwan Greens, and we've come to a point, I think, with a global pandemic and the globalization that we have spoken about in previous sessions and will continue to talk about in the sessions after this one. We've come to a point, I think, where people now are committing to working with Indigenous peoples a lot more than maybe in the early history of the Greens. This is good to see, and it's part of the decolonisation and re-sovereignizing process that Indigenous peoples hope to see and work within their partnership with Greens across the globe. Just before we go to our first speaker, there is a bit of housekeeping I need to remind people of. The sessions are recorded. We do have interpreters, so you should have access to a button on your screen that will give you the interpretation in, I think, Spanish we have for this session, or you can go backwards and forwards depending on English or Spanish on the speaker and your own situation. We are hoping to put together resources after the session. So as well as recording it, we hope to put together resources that will help people understand a little bit about what an Indigenous Global Greens Network can do or will look like, and we hope to send that out through the conference organisers when all the sessions are finished. So without further ado, as I say, I would like to please introduce our first speaker, Tiano Tuiano from Aotearoa, New Zealand Greens. He's a parliamentarian in that country, and his topic will be indigenising the Aotearoa New Zealand Green Party. Tiano has over 20 years experience as an activist, an advocate, and organiser at local, national, and international levels. He attributes his interest in political change to his mum, Ngāpuhi, and his grandfather, Atui. I hope I pronounced that properly. After going to the anti-Springbok tour protest with his mum in 1981, the idea of making things better stuck with him. After high school, he went to Auckland University and found himself learning about politics in Dr. Ranganui Walker's class. The next year, he enrolled in an environmental science paper taught by Jeanette Fitzsimmons. He credits this for opening his eyes on issues around biodiversity and climate change, which has driven much of his work since. In Pacifica communities, Tiano is known for his work in the education sector and climate change advocacy, while in Maori communities, he is known for his Indigenous rights activism. He has a particular interest in working at the crossroads of Indigenous rights and environmental issues, and has worked in the United Nations and is working to ensure the voices of remote Indigenous communities on the front lines of climate change and biodiversity are heard. So welcome, Tiano.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. First of all, I'll greet you with a traditional greeting in our language here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I wanted to say, tēnā koutou katoa ki rungi ngā āhuatanga o te wā, e mihi ana ki ngā kaumātua, ngā koro ngā koe I tuku iho mai ngā mātou rangatake ki tēnā o tātou. Ko au tēnei no Ngāpuhi me nai takoto no te raki o te ika, ko tōku pāpā no te pāi no te kukiarere. Nō reira, Māori ora ki te whenua, Māori ora ki te rangi, Māori ora ki te awa, Māori ora ki te awa. Tātou anoa e karapine ki raro te tuanui o Ranginui ki runga koe a papa tuanui ki raro. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody and traditional greetings. I wanted to acknowledge our elders, past and present, and the connections between Indigenous activist elders, people that have guided me through my journey in terms of doing all the things that we need to do to ensure Indigenous people's issues are always at the forefront of this kaupapa, acknowledging those who have passed on and acknowledging the connections to the mountains, to the sea, to our lands, to the rivers running right out to the ocean. So to all our Indigenous brothers and sisters over there listening via the Zoom call, I'd just like to say, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Thank you to our hosts from over in the ditch for opening this up for me. And I was just reflecting on where I met Dominic. Actually was at a protest supporting our whānau, Garawa whānau from Borrolula way, who were protesting against fracking and mining on their traditional lands. And for me, it always it's one of the things that has always strengthened me was this idea of Indigenous solidarity, Indigenous connections. And I've been fortunate enough to head over to the ditch every now and then and to do work with different Aboriginal activists over that side of the ditch. And it was one of my brothers, Jason Daylight de Santolo, who took me to the protest where I met the brother Dominic over there as well. And I learnt the differences of what it means to come from a big country, because I remember when I was talking to my bro who I spent quite some time with over in Australia, and I tell him about how some of our communities are remote, and I remember him telling me, "You don't know remote, mate. You wait till you come up to Borrolula in the Northern Territory, I'll show you remote." I was like, "Oh, mate, it took 3 hours to go up the road there." He goes, 3 hours, that's just right up to the shop, mate. And so I learned what it meant to be, to journey around truly big country and traveling on one of the roads. And I remember saying to him after driving straight for about, 8 hours, I says, "When does this road bend?" And he goes, "Well, I told you, we've got a different type of remoteness in it." And And some of it comes from with the smaller land masses and connection to the islands. It kind of reminded me of how the impact of land and space can, how it impacts the way that we think and feel about the land as well. And that was one of the learnings that I've taken with me when I've journeyed around that part of the world, and also had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Redfern back in the day. It's been a while since I've been up in Redfern, but then also in the Aboriginal Tent Embassy when Auntie Isabella Coe and them were there some time ago as well. So I had some very fond memories connecting with people over there as well. So my name is Te Anau Tuiono. I'm one of the Green Party MPs in the New Zealand Parliament. There are 3 Māori MPs. There's myself, Dr. Elizabeth Kerekere, who's from the Tairāwhiti, from the east side of the North Island, and our co-leader Marama Davidson, who's from the same iwi as me. She's from the Tai Tokero. So currently 30% of the parliamentarians for the Green Party are Indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've been going on a bit of a journey, as well as I guess we all have, in terms of what it means to make sure that we are pono to the kaupapa. Because one of the things that I've learned, not through the academic process of the stuff that I picked up around biodiversity and climate change, but sitting with elders and stuff like that, is that real purposeful connection with the whenua, that real connection to the land, how that was really embedded into terms of who we are, how we identify. For example, in the beginning, I mihi to our maunga, so we have relationships with maunga. So my maunga is whatatiri. So if I was to greet people, I would say, ko tōku ingo, ko Te Anau Tuiono. My name is Te Anau Tuiono. My maunga, ko tōku maunga, ko whatatiri maunga. My mountain is Whatatiri Mountain. Ko tōku awa, ko Waipao. My river is Waipao. And ko tōku marae, ko Poroti. So these connections are embedded into who we are as people. They are parts, physical locations within the environment, and so that has already been there. But when I learned stuff at the university through Western science and so on and so forth, the Western science, I find, is starting to catch up to Indigenous people's knowledge that actually people are part of the environment. We are part of the ecosystem, and that is a learning, I think, that we can all benefit from as people involved within the Green movement. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have the Treaty of Waitangi, and that was signed on Monday. We're going to be having a holiday. Actually, it's going to be Waitangi Day, and so that has been a point of contention here in Aotearoa, and a lot of our Indigenous protest movements have been around making sure that the government remember what happened at Waitangi, but then also making sure people understand the history of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and also the subsequent land wars that happened after the Treaty of Waitangi. And so through the years, what we have done here as Greens here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was to embed that into our charter. So we have the 4 charter principles as well, but the treaty, Te Treaty of Waitangi, is also threaded through our Green Party charter. So it acknowledges that Māori are tangata whenua. We are people of the land here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So not everybody has a treaty. I get that. I've been over the ditch, and sometimes some people have a number of treaties, and I'm not too sure if we have any brothers and sisters from Turtle Island. I've been over there a few times, and they've got dozens of treaties with different First Nations people and that. So here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have the one treaty, and so it took a while. This is before my time, about getting that embedded in, because of course it's a journey. You sometimes, politics is a journey, and some of us are further down the road than some other people. Some people are just beginning on that political journey. Often you find people that have no knowledge of the history of the country that we live in. They have no understanding about the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. They have no understanding about the land wars that followed the Treaty of Waitangi, because for a very, very long time, and even continuing today, that history was purposefully forgotten because it was uncomfortable. It made the dominant Pākehā population, the white people here in Aotearoa New Zealand, feel uncomfortable. But it is what it is, and it's really important that we continue to remind people about the dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the Crown-sponsored theft of Indigenous peoples' lands, in our case here in Aotearoa New Zealand. So the Treaty of Waitangi, the Indigenous text of the Treaty of Waitangi guaranteed our absolute possession of our lands, our taonga, our awa, and all of those things. It's actually embedded into the Treaty of Waitangi. And so I guess having those really important conversations with our members that are not Indigenous as well, and trying to find different allies who are ready to stand up for and support as allies. And so one of the things that we've done, we recognise that with the Treaty of Waitangi, people that are honouring of the Treaty of Waitangi, that gives them access to be here in a good way, to be here in Aotearoa New Zealand in a good way. So we refer to them as tangata treaty, or people of the treaty. So you have tangata whenua, people of the land, it's Indigenous peoples, Māori, and then there are those people that have a recognition of that it was the Treaty of Waitangi which enabled them to come here in a good way, and so we refer to them as tangata tiriti. And then of course there are those relationships that we have all around the Pacific as well, because there are those genealogical connections, the whakapapa connections to around the Pacific as well, and we refer to them as tangata moana, or people of the ocean. And so the connection between the tangata whenua, people of the land, and the people of the ocean, and recognizing that even before the treaty there is relationships that go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But then also I think there is that also really important work of acknowledging the connections between struggles of Indigenous peoples around the world within our local Pacific region as well, and the history of those struggles and the relationships that people have built over time in relationships to those struggles. And I think of movements like the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement. I was fortunate to hear from Oscar Tamaru last year, reflecting on the situation in Maohi Nui, the connections between the land rights movements, and we've had people coming back and forth between here and over in Australia for a very, very, very long time. I've just been one of those people. And then of course the work that was done on all the different kaupapa as well. So I think it's really the important thing is for us to reach out to see where the other Indigenous Greens are, and I'm really glad that this work is starting to reignite again, to build those connections as well in the spirit of Indigenous people solidarity. And with that solidarity, we can then make those connections with other people that have a heart for community, have a heart for the environment, understand that we are living in the context of a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and that part of that crisis is based on racism and the dispossession of Indigenous people's lands and resources and our whenua, and trying to sever those connections to our sacred spaces. And as Greens, it is our role to stand with and be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples wherever we stand. So kia ora, I'm not too sure if I've run the clock out, but I can leave that for now. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Giano. Thank you very much. We appreciate your contribution to the session and reorganising your schedule in short time. We really appreciate it. Participants, next we'll go to our speaker from the African Greens Federation. Dr. Mohammad Awad has been a member of the Egyptian Green Party since its inception in 1990 and currently serves as the party president. Dr. Awad is the second vice president of the African Greens Federation. Between 2012 and 2013, he served as a member of the Egyptian Parliament, leading international affairs and the National Security Committee. Dr. Awad studied a Bachelor of Science Chemical Engineering at Cairo University, and has experience in environmental engineering. Dr. Awad obtained his Bachelor of Law from Cairo University, and his Masters of Law from the Institut des Droits des Affaires Internationales. His experience in the field of law saw him become a founder and partner of Guard and Fair Group law firm. Dr. Awad specializes in commercial arbitration and industrial project agreements. Dr. Awad, I'm aware, has to leave this session early for another, so I hope we can keep to time. He is speaking at this session, obviously, Decolonisation and Justice for Indigenous People. You can also see Dr. Awad's participation in the Greens Struggle for Democracy in Africa session, and what was at COP26 and how can we build momentum ahead of COP27. And there is a session by the Africa Greens Federation that Dr. Awad is also involved in. Thank you, Dr. Awad.
Thank you a lot, Dominic, for this kind introductions for me. At the beginning, I would like to thank ABGF for hosting me in these serious sessions. And very honest, I didn't hear about the indigenous problem before, or the indigenous issue before, just 1 month ago. So I was so intensifying in reading about the issue. And actually, it was a very difficult mission to me. So before forgetting, just I would like also to express my deep thanks to Global Green and the organizer of this Congress. And before just starting, I would like to clarify some remarks related to the title of the topic of this discussion. First remark for me, the speaker in this discussion, whom are very distinguished persons scientifically and politically, came from Australia, New Zealand, India, beside Egypt, which means that all the participants come from countries that were colonized by British hegemony. These countries got their independence at the same period of time almost. Yet still there are a gap among these countries regarding their level of gross progress and development, which unveil a huge gap in the capacity of each state, as well as a gap in the welfare of its citizens. My second remark, the topic of the discussion, which is ending colonization and repairing the colonial era consequences, which means that this title entails the importance of defining what colonization is. This would allow us to know what we are actually calling to end and how to deal with its consequences. Saying otherwise would mean that we are fighting in vain. My third remark, the topic of this discussion, link between ending colonization and fair compensation for the indigenous people in the colonized countries. And here I'm saying, who said that colonization could be end? And my fourth remark, the topic of the discussion, I believe it came along with a lot of political current discussion happening in many think tanks and also in the media, especially the British one. This ongoing discussion revolves around the British strategy in the near future and whether it is in interest of UK to open up to the world or to stay in isolation and self-sufficiency policies. These were my initial remarks regarding the topic of the discussion. But what I represent, and due to expansion of the topic, I will only focus on 2 points. The first, it is about the colonization and its definition before the Industrial Revolution. While the second point, the remnant of colonization and its evaluations in the post-industrial revolution era. Actually, I disagree with a lot of historians and writers regarding limiting the start of colonization to the end of the 7 Years' War, which resulted in reducing the idea of colonization to the era of post-industrial revolution only. Colonization, which is a term that is used to describe expansionist policies that were followed by the European countries after the Second World War, and which resulted in expansionist policies religiously or culturally that aim to support their means in controlling the destiny of the other nations and abusing their resources for the interests of the colonizers. Despite this definition of colonization, we should not disregard the definition of colonization period to that era in order to have a better understanding of the idea of colonization. And for example, the attacks by tribes on other tribes, these attacks were mainly for the purpose of resources, not settlement, because simply by then, there were no geographical borders. Here, I shall raise a debatable question. Is there a link or relation between the idea of colonization and geographical borders? Geographical borders are borders that draw ownership limitation and resources limitation, and it makes these resources under the hegemony of a certain human group. Could we say that some current conflicts happening in some area of the world aim to redraw geographical border? And therefore, could we evaluate that as a new colonial campaign? Also, can we say that colonization in definition could be limited to the capacity of each human group to protect its resources against any attacking action threatening such resources? Also, the previous questions lead me to ask another question, which may annoy some. Is colonization a dynamic or a static status? Perhaps before the end of this discussion, answers may arise to such questions. I did a great effort to realize the idea of the culture's goal of colonization, which is a realistic case we see in many colonized countries. I believe that the culture's goal of colonization aim to connect deeply the colonizers to the colonized countries to ensure the latter's dependence on the former politically and economically. But the question, is it still valid? Can the culture's accumulation of the colonized nations lead to the humanitarian integration between the people of the colonial and the colonized states? Can we say that religious goal of colonization is a part of large drill institution, which is a culture's goal? I raise this question due to internal national call in Egypt to reform the religious discourse and how people respond and evaluate such calls. It's a lesson for us. This leads me to what is called the religious goal of colonization, which were summarized by many thinkers as the motive of ethical conflict rather than the religious one with very little exceptions. It could be accepted that the religious wars that took place in the Middle Age don't apply the idea of religious goal of colonization, considering that these wars were among equal countries, each of whom was considered a colonial state. I also remember that the Crusade Wars were not part of the religious goals of colonization, as some propagate in our country. What's constant and a fact is that the Crusade Wars had the cross as their slogan for reasons that don't relate to colonizing a certain region, but for dilemma of spreading the new Christianity and for calling for tolerance away from wars. This may differ from the Islamic wars that had an aim of spreading the Islamic religions. That was a needed introduction before going deeply in the post-industrial revolution era. My points of concern here, in order to match the title of the discussion, is to pass by quickly the cases that were the result of colonization in such era post the industrial revolution, and these cases could be summarized in the following. Number one, the slavery case, which explained by some as one of the remnant of the colonial era. Quickly, I would say that slavery was a recognized and settled system since the early stage, and that this system had legacy accordingly, until the announcement of the Universal Declaration for the Human Rights, which ended the commercial of slavery, admitting the only exception is the case of kidnapping of African to America, as it was violating the law. A second case, the foreign occupation case. Some people mix between the military foreign occupation case and the independence of a country. Many of the liberation movements stopped its national project upon the withdrawal of the foreign military from its land. This is what an Algerian leader said when he assured that the mistake that the revolutionary liberation movement made was that they believed that the withdrawal from foreign military forces from their countries means independence. And that was a serious mistake. My third case, what we call the national sovereignty. The sovereignty of the state doesn't mean its independence or the withdrawal of the occupation. The national sovereignty is a constrained idea in its definition and application according to each era. So it's a variable meaning. A last case, the geographical borders were drawn without the participation of the indigenous people, but according to the interests of colonial powers, whether to increase their political influence or to reach economic resources or to impose its culture or sometimes to spread its religion. Maybe it's time to ask an important question, which is colonization a term with a good or a bad reputation? This is a question in which I believe it cannot have precise answer, but we can have some indications to help us replying to these questions through displaying some examples. New Netherlands. I'm sure that all of you remember what does it mean, and remember that name very well. It is a Dutch colony, and it fell under colonization of United Kingdom after the weakness of Netherlands. This land has been renamed on the eastern shore of the United States of America, and now it's called New York, or as it has been called currently, the Big Apple. My second example, Sydney, or that what traveling in continent. This continent that has been used as an exile for a prisoners yet. It gained its independence in the 18th century, and currently it's one of the main influential factors in the international trade. And the Australian people, as far as I read, refused to have independence from United Kingdom in 2001. Fourth example, India, which gained independence 1947 and has launched in its international frame as one of the economic tigers, despite its overpopulations. A fourth and last, Egypt, was invaded by Britain twice. The first invasions took place in 1807, and it failed under the leadership of Fraser, while the second invasion took place in 1882. United Kingdom needed to keep a certain balance regarding Egypt, so that if Egypt is not under British occupation, at least it could keep Egypt under its control in a way or another. This need for a British balance resulted in a package of reform inside Egypt, and one of it is the rail station system and the organizational management, as well as political and constitutional reforms, which all resulted in improvement in several areas and fields, educational, culture, etc. This means that the British occupation in Egypt left a good impression to many of the local, to the extent that some of them saw the British occupation as a better opportunity compared to the occupation of Ottoman Empire. What I would like to clarify is that no one can assure whether the colonial era is a positive or a negative era, as the Big Apple was actually established by colonization, but at the end, it became one of the most important cities in the world. Also, same happened in Australia. India could be relatively less, but it's still prominent in the world of superpower. On the other hand, Egypt is still taking its early steps in the path of building a modern state, although that colonization is the same of the examples previously mentioned, but the gap is obvious among each example. So how can we explain that? Could we say that the consequences of colonial era and to what extent it is positive or negative experience doesn't only stand or depend on colonial power, but is it a process over dual nature between the colonial power and the colonized? Could we sign that some nations have the capacity and the will to get benefit and to benefit others, while other nations don't have such capacity? Maybe we can all remember the demands by the Lebanese people to the President Macron during his visit to Lebanon a few weeks ago. Where are the people requested Macron to return the French occupation to Lebanon again? This doesn't deny that colonization, and especially in the era of in the era post-industrial revolution, until today, hasn't taken the steps to correct its historical path of mistakes to raise the indigenous people. These mistakes that were the reason for giving the colonial era a shameful reputation. It is unfortunate to read in the news lately about recent attack on the region of indigenous people in Canada. And in that regard, we are looking forward to what will the Canadian Green do about it. As the Green's condemnation that can be directed to colonization lies in the cases of slavery and the indigenous people. Thank you so much. Sorry for long.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Awad. Thank you. Participants, next we go to our speaker from India Greens Party. Suresh Notial is founder, patron, and mentor of the India Greens Party. He is an alternate delegate to the Global Greens Coordination from the Asia Pacific Greens Federation. Also, he's a member on the Political Activities Group, which I think after these sessions will have lots more food for thought. He's a member and has put together the policy for APGF on Indigenous and tribal peoples. He's been a senior journalist, writes plays and poetry. His affiliations include India Greens Party as founder, patron and mentor, the Uttarakhand Fighters, Independent Media Initiative Society, Public Media Trust, where I believe he's a member of the Board of Trustees, and the Human Rights Law Network. Please welcome our guest speaker from India Greens Party, Suresh.
Hello, Suresh. Are you on mute?
We have the slides, but no audio.
Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very good. Thank you, Suresh.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. On behalf of the India Greens Party and myself, I would like to welcome all the panelists, participants, and guests here at Connecting for Green Action organized by the Global Greens. We also thank our dear friend Dominic for facilitating this session on decolonization and justice for Indigenous people. Friends, it has been a tough journey for more than the last 2 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only impacted our lives, but also our politics and the future of humankind. So if we do not correct our politics, we are destined to face many more troubles. Coming to the main topic, decolonization and justice for Indigenous people, I must say that it is also about politics. So I would like to say a few words on colonization first. Nick, next, please. So many places throughout the world look white today, but they were actually black or brown, red, or even yellow before their colonization. The unpretentious words of a phrase, white Australia has a black history, are self-expressive, with deep meaning as deep as the oceans around Australia. This phrase applies to several other places in the world, and it does not require historians or sociologists to dig out the anthropological past to know that several white lands were black, brown, red, or yellow. The fact is that colonization stretched across time and around space. In the ancient and medieval past and in the age of discovery, colonization was practiced uninterruptedly. And then the second industrial revolution in the 19th century accelerated it even with the help of muscle and weapons. Whatsoever, colonization has been an exploitative practice, therefore, a traumatizing experience, especially for the indigenous people. As a consequence, the colonized people, mostly indigenous, suffered poverty, malnutrition, diseases, cultural upheaval, economic exploitation, political disadvantage, and systematic programs aimed at creating a sense of social and racial inferiority. Next, please. India was no exception to colonization. Portuguese Vasco da Gama's maritime success discovered for Europeans a new sea route to India in 1498. It paved the way for direct Indo-European commerce. The Portuguese soon set up trading posts in Goa, Daman Diu, and Bombay, now Mumbai. Later, colonization strengthened with Britain's involvement in India in support of the English East India Company. Other countries such as France and Portugal also had involvement in the colonial expansion in India. Eventually, the English East India Company was given permission by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in 1617 to trade in India. Ultimately, the British, except a few exceptions like Goa and Pondicherry, won all the territories in India from their European brethren. The internal conflicts among Indian kingdoms gave opportunities to the Europeans to gradually establish political influence and appropriate lands and suppress people. In a nutshell, the process of colonization in India, like in any other colonized country, took place through decades of oppression of indigenous and other people and was perpetuated by structures of white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Here is an example how an indigenous person, Birsa Munda, born in the last quarter of the 19th century in Chota Nagpur Plateau area of India, protested colonization and Christianity. Having gained awareness of the British colonial rulers and the efforts of the missionaries to convert indigenous people to Christianity, Birsa Munda started a new faith, which turned into a challenge to British conversion activities. Eventually, he was strongly entrenched in the movement against the British oppression of the indigenous communities. Later, he died in a jail at the young age of 25. Though Birsa lived a short span of life, he is known to have mobilized the indigenous communities against the British colonizers. Finally, India won freedom from the British on 15th of August 1947 after a long drawn freedom struggle led by M.K. Gandhi and so many others, some of them rebellious, most of them non-violent. Next, please. However, the process of decolonization is not yet over. In fact, it looks that colonization is a historical as well as an ongoing global project where settlers continue in different ways to occupy lands, dictate social, political, and economic systems, and exploit local people and their resources. And efforts to indigenize or appropriate indigenous approaches to life or even falsely claiming indigenous identity do not contribute to decolonization, but further colonize indigenous knowledge and identity. Do you know whose land you travel, work, and live on? Just think about the land that you are on and the indigenous people who have long stewarded that land. Think about the land that colonizers unjustly claimed redefined, and repurposed. Today, so many countries are decolonized in the political sense, but at the socio-cultural or even religious and linguistic levels, so many communities in those countries still remain colonized. This means it is still a task for us and everywhere. Adani, whom Indians and Australians notoriously know, is a glaring example of how modern colonizers, in a very subtle and smart way, continue to occupy lands or minds by dictating social, political, and economic systems and exploiting indigenous people and their resources and cultures everywhere in India or Australia. Next. So there is an urgent need for the realization that the colonized lands belong to the indigenous people and they have a sacred duty to protect those lands and animals inhabited on those lands with which they had an affiliation through their ancestry, traditions, and systems. Apart from the economic losses, there were other huge losses due to colonization. It is not easy to excavate the pain and pangs suffered by the indigenous people. In fact, the history of the colonized indigenous people is full of anguish, anger, and deep woundedness. These people still carry pain in their hearts. The losses were many. Some of them were as follows. From the UK to the USA, South Africa, and New Zealand, and from Spain to Chile, traces of colonization still remain in one way or the other. So English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, all of them were colonizers in not very old history. The colonizers or trespassers were committed to nothing less than total occupation of the lands. Dispossessed of the lands in several places that had nourished them for centuries, the colonized indigenous people became dependent, though they were self-sufficient before the arrival of European colonizers, and they did not need to travel far from their lands, since the resources around them were so abundant and trade with other groups was so well established. The colonizers destroyed the land, which were home to hundreds of precious species. The colonizer pushed the colonized people to other areas, pushed them to the wall. In fact, the colonizers tried to destroy rich cultures, history, traditions, traditional laws, languages, traditions, lands, forests, wildlife, marine life, and connection to land and sea of the indigenous people. Killing of local people, in most cases indigenous people, was quite easy with the weapons. The European colonization solidified all capitalist endeavors by providing new markets and new materials. Next, please. As regards India, the India Greens Party remains committed to the larger interests of the tribal and indigenous communities. The tribal and indigenous people have a special place in our party and hold senior position in the decision-making bodies of the organization. In fact, one of the co-presidents of the India Greens Party is an indigenous minority Christian. Our future plans include to launch campaigns to protect their land, forest, river, and water bodies, agriculture, and other livelihoods. We want them in the mainstream of society, economy, and politics. We want to decolonize them from the neo-colonization led by the corporates like Adani, who have exploited and underpaid their workforce, have a history of corruption, bribery, and human rights abuses, and the corporates who use police intimidation, bribery, and threats to dispossess the indigenous people of their lands. And the Indian Constitution already has provisions for protection of the indigenous people, though not implemented in letter and spirit. Now, measures for decolonization. The goal of decolonization has to be to achieve sovereignty, the right and ability to practice self-determination over lands, cultures, languages, and political, social, and economic system. The point is that decolonization has to be about social, cultural, psychological, and economic freedom for those people who were colonized by the foreigners. There are a few things to be done in the true spirit of decolonization. A, need for recognizing history of the colonized indigenous people and their continued resilience against erasure, extraction, and oppression. B, should not only dedicate to thinking about decolonizing, must act to decolonize. C, must continue to regain traditional access to their lands. D, oppose neo-imperialism, which is the continued occupation, exploitation, and destruction of lands traditionally divided by the indigenous people. E, read more and more black, brown, red, yellow, and indigenous literature. F, decolonize curriculum and thinking and deconstruct colonial influences on knowledge and education. G, decolonize at the level of cultures, traditions, languages, religions, beliefs, economies, etc., and catch up with the cultures, traditions, languages, religions, beliefs, and economies that you inherited. Do not allow anybody to colonize in the name of superiority. The color of his skin, the ethnicity, the language, the religion, the belief, etc., do not make anybody superior or inferior. Go back to the traditional green ways to survive sustainably and evolve ecologically and intellectually. Create systems which are just and equitable, addressing inequality through education, dialogue, communication, and political action. Deconstruct settler imposed systems that continue to oppress black, brown, yellow, and red indigenous people. Eliminate colonialism, gendered and racialized hierarchies, and establish indigenous sovereignty. Oppose the Westminster model of governance that was an imposed system and that never recognized the traditional system of governance. Go back to the practices of ancestors and say goodbye to God, who was introduced to you by the colonizers. Remember, the beliefs of your ancestors were noble and closer to nature, more ecological. Ask your government to have a treaty with the First Nations or indigenous people to ensure your traditional rights, safety, security, health, education, housing, and employment. Re-sovereignize the tribal and indigenous communities everywhere in the world. So now I come to the conclusion. In a nutshell, Global South, populated by so many indigenous communities, must not allow the Global North rule or ruin it. To achieve this, we must build or reinvigorate a global network of the indigenous peoples under the leadership of the Global Greens and re-sovereignize the indigenous communities throughout our planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suresh. Great food for thought. Next participants, we move to Dr. Janara Gorangorin. Dr. Janara is the Australian Capital Territories Green Senator pre-selected and Secretary of the Australian Greens First Nations Network. Dr. Janara has already spoken at some previous sessions, one on Lake Pedder, where the Greens are talking about the 21st century challenges of global warming and biodiversity. She obviously speaks at our session, and she is also the founder and CEO of One Inma Global, a transformational leadership company that utilizes her PhD research in sacred leadership, integrating Western and First Nations knowledge systems. She is a mother and grandmother of girls and a committed, engaged community member of the ACT Ngunnawal region, where she has lived since 1978. She has worked in women's services and in addiction and trauma recovery community-based agencies in the United States of America and Australia, and has been on many boards of federal and state ministers. Dr. Janara is a recipient of the RSL Indigenous Master's Scholarship and has worked in India, Mexico, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and France, doing transformational self-managing leadership. We welcome her to our session. We thank her for her cultural introduction. Please welcome Dr. Janara.
Palya everyone, hello. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to go straight into my session and share my screen with you all. If something technical happens, I'll get Nick to take over. So please be patient with me while I just sort this out. Let me see if I can get it up. Oh, it's not working. So Nick, can I ask you to open the PowerPoint that I sent you, the second one? If you have it, not the first one. And we can start. I don't know why it's not opening. My apologies. Nick, are you there?
Up now. That should be up now. Yep. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Thanks so much. My talk today is not on the process of decolonisation as a political process, because I knew the other speakers were going to talk about that. But at the end, I'm going to just share some quotes from our First Nations senators. What I want to talk about today is how we personally decolonise ourselves, because the journey of colonisation, decolonisation, is not just about the political, the economic, or the social, or the cultural business, but it is about how we as human beings, as First Nations people, heal and recover from the trauma of being generationally acculturated, having to adapt to the majority culture in order to survive the onslaught of attempted genocide and violence that comes with the war that they brought with them, and with the dysfunctionality that they brought with them in family systems. So my background is in the area of psychology and social work. My current work is in the area of sacred leadership, bringing back our cultural ways and traditions into our consciousness and our ways of being. So that's why I'm doing this today. Nick, if you can go to the next one. I would ask you all to just now think about the cultural process of decolonisation. We go back to country, we sit with each other, we create circles. We don't start doing things like white people have taught us to do. We have spent our whole lives learning how to be migloos, as we say, white people, because we're forced to it. Our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our great-grandmothers, our great-grandfathers, the generations right back to the time that the colonisers first came to your country and to our country, we have been forced to do exactly what they want, or they killed us. And when they stopped killing us, they then had other ways of doing that in the political system, in the economic system, in the social and education system. What I've learned in my time, and I'm 63 years old, so I've had a few years on the planet, not enough, but enough to learn a few things. And what I've learned is that when I went back to my culture and cultural strength, and I changed my white fella name, and I let go of the Catholic God that we were conditioned to, and if I started following my elders and being that person, being that First Nations person, living on Noora land with Walter, my family, and that country, then I became decolonised. And I realised in my 20s that I had to learn somehow to decondition myself, but I didn't really know how to. And the way was found for me, really, because of that desire. So first comes the desire, then the courage and the willingness to do it, because it takes a long time sometimes. It doesn't happen overnight. So we start by going back to our cultural roots. We start by being with our elders, our elder women and our elder men, and we start by listening to the people who really hold the law, who know about country, who know about our laws and our ways of being, and we go and sit in the talking circle. Nick, if you could put the next one on. So today I'm opening the talking circle. There's something missing. If you could go to the next one. Yes, let me play Dadiri. I'll need you to hit the arrow that's at the bottom of the slide, Nick. There should be an arrow. Oops. At the bottom of the Dadiri slide. No. It should just play if you click on it.
I'm sorry, I can't see it. Oh, here we go.
Auto play. Yeah.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, if it's not going to play, we don't need to use it. So I'll talk to it. Maybe just go back to the page. Go back. Yeah. We use a process in our culture where we train our children from very early on to listen deeply to the self. First, we teach them to listen deeply to the land, to listen deeply to the self, to the spirit, and listen deeply to the relationships and the people around them. But what's most important is that they learn to be who they really are. Acculturation forces us to not be who we are. It shames us into not acting or being from our First Nations way. So I'm sorry that this won't play, but you can find it on YouTube at any time under this name. Auntie Miriam Rose Hungerber is an elder and Senior Australian of the Year last year, and she gave Dadiri to all the non-Indigenous people in our nation to explain to them why it's so important for us to be the sovereign people and the people who actually run the country in a way, because we're the ones who know it, we're the ones who love it, and we're the ones who can take care of it. We learn this from deep listening. So deep listening is the practice called Dadiri. Every single nation in our country, there's 650 of them, had a process of deep listening to the self. So we'll go to the next slide, Nick, because we can't play that one. And in doing so, we learn about our feelings, we learn about our intellect, we learn about our cultural traditions, our ways of knowing and being. We learn about being spirit beings in human form. We learn about how to live on the earth. We practiced our spiritual process of ceremonies on our land with our songlines and our sacred sites. And we start the journey of returning down the songline that was taken from us. In our culture, all our songlines from every clan intersect each other and make connection across country, across Nunjinatia, Australia. And so it's very important to go back to the spiritual process because that's where it began. When we are born as spirit beings in human form. This is our belief system. And so we have to nurture that spirit process first. And then it heals the emotional, mental, and cultural trauma that occurred because of colonisation. But it's a journey that each person has to do from inside the self, and that each person has to do it themselves. And so they have to be willing to make that decision and that choice. I can intellectually think about it. I can politically fight for it. I can advocate for it. I can be an activist, but I must walk the talk of actually practicing the law. And that's what we're taught in our culture. So it's really about returning to a higher consciousness or a higher way of being for us, because we're taught that that's the way we take care of country. That's the way we take care of relationships. And that's the way we take care of self. Nick, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you for helping. And so when we do the ceremonies on land, when we take care of the sacred places, when we honour our sacred sites, when we take care of our children, we had a highly functional society. We lived here as the longest living culture in the world. Thousands and hundreds of thousands, no words for time. But you know, white people, they like to carbon date everything. So they reckon we've been here about 80,000 years. But we say that we have been here forever. And so it's about knowing that your system is the right system, and that the white dominant culture has come out of imperialism and the need to discover and explore the rest of the world and take over things, and the need for power and greed and so on. Become who we really are through the ceremonies, the songs and the dances. These are the things that heal us being on country. The next slide, please, Nick. Oh, has something happened to my slide there? Oh, there it is. So as we heal our spirit and our cultural process, then it naturally begins to heal the social, ecological, environmental and political systemic processes that we are all involved in our day-to-day lives as human beings living in a dominant culture, living in two worlds, living in a 12. It begins the process of healing land. Our elders for many years, 30, 40 years ago, started telling the Australian government that the land is sick because we are sick. Because for us, the inextricable link between land, family, relationships, the spirit world, the human world, and the way in which we exist on the planet is the same. Everything is the same. So if the land is sick because they are destroying it, they're digging it up, they're mining it, they are doing whatever they're doing to it, they're putting rubbish in it, it actually makes my body sick. Because for us, our bodies are the same as the earth, our Nunjanatia, our mother. It's a difficult some of these concepts are difficult to grasp because this is the way we think and this is the way we be, but this is the way it is for us to decolonize ourselves. Please go to the next slide. And so the process of healing begins. So this is just to help you understand. So I've made these slides and I've left them with Nick so that everybody can get a copy of them if you want to and use them later on, please do, to explain how the system existed before they came. So we were a highly functional system, not dysfunctional. We didn't have violence. We had a law called Kanyini, which was about the maintenance of peace and harmony, of unconditional love for the flora, the fauna, everything around us, of using our ceremonial and cultural lives to sustain the earth, to sustain ourselves. We don't just sing the rain, we become the rain. We don't just sing and do dances for the sustenance and the protection of the animals. We become those animals. And so we feel this deep, inextricable connection so much to everything around us that we have an impact on it in a spiritual, cultural way. And so that's what our people did for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's what every Indigenous culture in the world did on their country for the times that they lived there before white people came or before the Euro-Western people came. And so it's an ancient system that we can return to. And the period of colonisation, in a way, people say, you know, well, it's a long time because it's traumatic. But in a way, when you think about it in terms of how long we've been here, hundreds of thousands of years, the period of colonisation is only 235, I think, in Australia, 234, something like that. It's a short period of time in our timeline. And so when we decondition ourselves from what they taught us, we go back to the original knowledge that we have, and it brings us health, contentment, and it gets rid of the sorrow. I'll explain why. It's because of the emotional, mental, cultural, and spiritual intelligence that you gain from returning to your own way of being. Please go to the next slide. Thank you, Nick. So when we get colonised, we become acculturated, and it happens over generations of families growing up, as long as they are on our lands. We adapt to the dominant majority culture in order to survive, because they come here bringing war. You know, they bring war, they introduce drugs and alcohol and chemicals, they introduce the dysfunctionality that's in their culture, and they expect us to just go along with it. And we go along with it because of the way that our laws are. Our laws are about having good relationships with other human beings. Our laws are not about fighting war. Our laws are not about violence. Our laws are about the maintenance of peace and harmony on the earth. And so all our processes and all our education system and all our training for all of those thousands of years was about maintaining that. So when Captain Cook and all that mob came to this place, to Nunjanatia, this place was in a very pure state. The water was pure. The land was pure. There was abundance. And then suddenly in 230 odd years, they have completely destroyed nearly all of it. They're pretty quick. So to reverse the process of acculturation within the self and within the system and within the culture, which produces suicide, trauma, incarceration, all of those really horrible mental health illnesses and so on, we have to take the responsibility to take it back. So what we do is we start the cultural business. And we learned this from the First Nations mob in Canada, the First Nations mob in America, back in the 70s and 80s when we started engaging with them. We learned from them because they were doing talking circles. They were saying the culture heals. And so we started, it took 20 years, but we started doing the same thing. But we also have people who live in remote parts of Australia and live in other parts of Australia in the cities now, because the next generation is also being taught this stuff, who have held on to the law, who've lived the law, who don't care about what white people do. They just keep doing what they have to do. And when we learn from them and we walk with them and we're around them, then we return those who were stolen, those who were taken from land and brought up on missions. They begin the healing process and they come back to their ways of being. Please go to the next slide, Nick. So what happens in the psyche is that these are the things that happen that come from Western culture. This is what they bought. They bought this rubbish. They colonize us. The basis of all family systems dysfunction are these things, and the foundational feeling is shame. So not only do they bring these dysfunctions to our lands, but they bring the feelings of fear, rage, anger, shame, and they then shame us. So all of these processes, chemical dependence to alcohol and introduced drugs, the physical, sexual and emotional violence that they were doing in their cultures, they brought it to our culture because we had no incest in First Nations Australia until they came, because of the way laws are established to keep children in a particular space and place. No sexual abuse of children. And now it's so dominant in our culture because of the process of acculturation, because of the trauma of what they did. So I learned this from white Americans. The psychological and mentally ill families are where people are taught to not be themselves. You're taught shame. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Do what I say, not what I do. There's hypocrisy. There's obsession, there's addiction, there's dependency, there's codependency, there's abuse. And so what we discovered from research that we did, that's been done the last 40, 50 years, is that children of acculturated families, that is colonised First Nations families, have the same behaviour patterns as children in white culture that grow up with these four things in their families of origin. So it proves that their dysfunction in their society, when it came here, it shamed and acculturated us to such a point that this is what happened to us. And we became so down, we began internalizing it, killing ourselves, killing each other, abusing our partners, doing all sorts of really dysfunctional things that are not part of our way of being. And the only way to change this is to change myself. I can't change another person, but I can change myself. I can reinvigorate my cultural, spiritual knowledge to decolonize and decondition myself so that I walk my talk, so that I'm a gentle, harmonious, peaceful, non-violent person, which was the cultural traditions before. So let's go to the next one. So this comes out of 50 years of research. It's not made up stuff. This is stuff you already know. I presume in your First Nations cultures, and this is what I've seen in the rest of the world in First Nations cultures. On the left, you see that they have an iteration of this, right? I'm using my own language. But in your own First Nations cultures on your country, there is an iteration of this. This is how people live. They live in communities, they live in circles, they share, they care. They napaji, they have mutual reciprocity. They take care of each other, they protect each other. But in white culture, and I'm talking generally, right? I'm not actually blaming or shaming any particular group. What I'm saying is this is generally what was going on when they became colonizers, when they started to imperialize the world, when they started to go out and conquer and trade and steal and take slaves. This is what was going on in their countries. And so how could they not bring that with them? Yeah? All the good things came too, but the bad things were the things that made the colonization traumatic. So returning to the idea that my kurumpa, my soul and my spirit can be healed, it is already okay. It never gets damaged. They can't take that off us. Returning to Nura, to land and living the proper way, having relationships in families that are functional, and learning to live in the chukapa, in the law, in the spiritual way, in the spiritual law, sharing and caring, listening deeply to the land, to the self, to others, and observing what's going on, but challenging everything about the dominant culture system that is not okay on your own country, because you're the self-sovereign of your country. You're the sovereign of your country. You're not just a sovereign because of some political property right. You're the sovereign because of your spiritual self-sovereignty. And so that's what we are doing in Australia, beginning this process. Please go to the next slide. And choosing not to engage in that kind of dysfunctional behaviour. So colonisation produces toxic shame. Healthy shame is a human condition. Toxic shame is a dysfunctional, traumatic human condition. So healthy shame is something like you learn in your culture and society. For example, we teach children that at a certain point in their lives, when they go out into the public, into the world, they wear clothes. They don't start going around naked when they get a bit older, usually after puberty. So the same happens in our culture. We teach modesty. People who do that, do exhibitionism and voyeurism, are carrying toxic shame. So what we look at in the picture in our lands is racism teaches you toxic shame, because it says you have no right to exist. You are not okay because you are Black. You are not okay because you're from this culture. You are not okay because you look like that, or whatever it is. And so over generations, teaching us all that in our skins, that we internalize this feeling that we are nothing, that we are a mistake, that we have to be like them. We cannot be accepted as human beings unless we do what they do. So then we have no right of self-determination. Self-determination is something that's in me. It's not an intellectual process. It is, but self-determination is knowing that I exist, that I have a right to exist, that I love myself, that I am a loveful, powerful being, and that I have a right to be on the planet, and no one has a right to take that away from me. And I'm not going to give up that right. But we do it with a gentleness in our country. We don't, we've had to demand it because they won't listen to us. So we don't shame the self. We stop shaming the self because that's what they did to us. So we turn it round. Yeah, we just reframe the whole system. So toxic shame says, I am the mistake. Guilt says, I made the mistake. Toxic shame says, I am a mistake. That's a big shift in feelings and consciousness. So when they came here, they said Australia was an empty land. There were actually no blackfellas here. And yet there right in front of them were all the blackfellas. And so legally, they said until 1993, 1998, they said, this place is empty. It only has kangaroos and flowers, or trees and rivers. It doesn't have any humans. Therefore, we can claim it as an English sovereign country. So they actually psychologically told us that we have no right to exist, which for a human being is actually in psychology a very traumatizing action. If your parents say that to you, it teaches you that you are nothing. So they did that to us for generations, and they did that to all of you across the world for generations. Please go to the next slide. And so taking back the idea of terra nullius, which is rubbish, we had to legally do in order for us to know that we have the sovereign right on our country through their legal system. 10-minute, 15-minute warning. This is what toxic shame does. So in our culture, that's what we have. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just keep an eye on the time so I don't go over. Please, Nick, thank you. So what we do is we begin by recreating the circles. We go back to the healthy developmental systems that we had before colonisation. And we sit and we start the healing process. And often it takes a long time. So for me, it's taken about 42 years. You know, I'm still not there, but I'm getting there. But I've been doing it for 42 years. And as a, you know, that sounds like a long process, but I think it's starting to heat up in Australia, and it's starting to happen faster because there's more recognition in Australia that First Nations people are sovereign, that they have the right to a treaty, and that they have a right to a voice. So in the Greens movement, it makes a big difference. Please go to the next slide. So we start to do the functionality in our system. We start to be kind to each other instead of being violent to each other. We start to come back to the integrated wholeness of our whole systems. We start by, we make sure our children are getting a cultural education, that they're not getting just the dominant culture education because it's toxic for us. We make sure that that's the strong part of them, that their cultural, spiritual life is strong. And then we make sure that their emotional, mental lives are strong by teaching them how to be like that. We become functional parents, in fact, rather than the dysfunctional ones that they tell us we are. Let's go to the next slide. So one of our main laws is Kanyini, the law of harmony, peace, and unconditional love. And if we use it as a consciousness in our practice, our ways of being every day, in fact, every moment we teach ourselves to live in the present moment, it helps the process of decolonisation. It actually does decolonise ourselves. It's been my 42 years of experience. We walk on the land, we begin to know who we are. We listen deeply to the land, we listen deeply to each other, we listen deeply to what is needed. We listen to the white people, we listen to the Migglers, and we say, yep, your world's pretty screwed up. How about we help you unscrew that? So we start the process of non-violence in a very non-violent way. And it's a pillar of the Australian Greens movement. And so we found as a Greens movement here, as a Black Greens movement, that we can use all the things that they talk about in a way that's healthy for us to change the dominant culture system so that we can become the foundation of that transformation. Because in my view, this is our country. So then First Nations people in our country, it's up to Aboriginal people to be the main foundation of what happens in this country. We have to return to the dominant culture no longer being the dominant culture, the dominant white culture. We have to return to us all in the same circle, doing it together. We can't kick them out. We can't send them back on the endeavour. It's gone, you know. We have to embrace them and we have to teach them, but we also have to teach them how not to live with their white privilege, how not to be white fragile people. And unfortunately, we're continually educating the Migloos, as our elders always say, you know, we have to educate them. They have no clue. They do know lots of clever stuff around science, lots of clever stuff around other things, which is useful, but they don't have the core of spirituality or cultural knowledge within their own culture. So how can they have it within our culture, on our country? So we have to show them the way, the path, the stories, the songlines. So in our Australian Greens First Nations network, that's the kind of vision we started with. You know, we were angry, people do activism, people have to speak strong, people have to stand up and be warriors. But in the end, we bring them together through the way in which we create the relationship with them. But we make sure that we do it from knowing that we're sovereign and that we're self-determining. It's not about asking them to give us anything. We already have it. It's about them recognizing that they didn't ever take it away from us and they have no right to hold on to it any longer. Please go to the next slide. So then we recreate a talking circle with the rest of the Greens movement. We use the basis of Dadiri, which is the deep listening process, which I've written here and you can read it later. It's too long to read now. Please go to the next slide. And we use the basis of our laws to bring them back into the fold. So the way we decolonise is having shared arrangement, shared agreements and shared outcomes. And we challenge it. We say, when you talk about us being sovereign people, when you say that sovereignty has never been ceded politically, every time you stand up and do an acknowledgement to country, but you don't walk that talk in your relationship with me by allowing me to be a sovereign, self-determining woman, what's that about? That's the hypocrisy of white culture. That's the white privilege. So you've got to learn to walk your talk. So we're going to hold you to that. We're going to say, no, we're sovereign people. So you're going to act with us as if we're sovereign people, not act from your sovereignty, which was stolen, which was placed upon us. You are going to act from our sovereignty. So then we say, you have a responsibility and a role to put us first. And we'll be integral and authentic with that. We'll do the right thing because we know how to. And then we align it with our values. And it's very challenging for the Migloo Greens network in Australia. It's very challenging for them. It's challenging for us because they're so big and there's so many people. But the way in which we started doing it was that we said we should start every national conference with a talking circle. Because you say we're the sovereign people, you say this is our land, why don't we do the welcome to country? Why don't we welcome you the way we always used to? Why don't we have a yarning circle where we yarn with you and you can ask us a lot of questions and we can tell you what it is we want to do. So that's what we've been doing for 2 years. In the beginning, they just listened. They never asked anything. They never said anything. They spent 2 hours sitting in a circle listening to us tell them everything about it, telling them the truth. We were like a truth and justice commission. We told them the story of how they damaged us. And then at the next conference 6 months later, we taught them about our law. And then the next conference 6 months later, we then let them ask questions. And then we let them dance and sing with us, and we did other things. We brought them into our cultural traditions first. Please go to the next slide. So now we have 2 senators in the Australian Senate, 2 First Nations women senators. We're about to have another one, and we're about to have a few more Black Greens in the Australian Parliament. But it's the relationship inside the Greens movement that we are gradually transforming. We are also transforming ourselves because this process of decolonisation is happening with each of us in our relationship in the Black Greens, but then it's also happening in the wider relationship with the Greens every moment that we talk and engage. So then we started to give them a message stick. So in our culture, we give message sticks to people to say, this is what we want to do, this is what we're doing, this is our story, how are you going to respond? And then they talk back to us. So it's an ancient tradition between nations. And so they've been very challenged by this, and it's actually taken 4 national conferences, and they still haven't given us back their half of the message stick, because we've asked them to look at their white privilege. We've asked them to look at their white fragility. We've asked them, why do you have white tears when we tell you about the truth about the past? Why do you treat us like tokens? Huh? It's very hard for white people to hear all this stuff, but we cannot decolonize them and decolonize ourselves unless we do it. So please go to the next slide. I think I'm nearly finished.
Thank you, Dr. Janara. We've got a few minutes, and
okay, so
we're going to
finish.
close our circle. That would be great to end our session. Thank you.
All right. So this is just something you can read afterwards at the end of the slides. And let's just go to the next slide, please, Nick. And I think we'll close off the circle. Maybe the next, yeah, close to the next slide because that one's not working. So I want to close my talk today by singing you a sacred song. This song was written by our women many thousands of years ago. We don't know when they wrote this song, but this song was about how the land was changing and breaking down, and the climate was changing, and the environment was falling apart, and the volcanoes were spewing, and the rain was coming, and the tsunamis were coming, and the animals and the trees started talking and started to tell the people, what are you doing? Why are you behaving this way? Why are you being greedy and violent? Why are you taking away from each other? You need to stop doing it because it's destroying our planet, our earth, our Nanjinatia. And so they went to Bayami, the Great Spirit, in the Chukapa, in the law, and they said, can you please do something about the people? Can you help us all? And so Bayami sent the rain, and he sent the rain to just rain and heal the land, to wash away all the negativity, to get rid of all the people who were doing the wrong thing, to bring people back to the recognition that they had to follow law, they had to live in law and culture and Chukapa. So now with the closing of the talking circle for our session, I'd like to sing you that sacred song. I would like to ask you to close your eyes in respect that the elders wrote this song many thousands of years ago and have given it to you as a gift today, to thank you for being with us all, and thank you for letting us all share. Thank you to Sherez. Thank you to Dr. Ahmad. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Nick, for helping us and for being with us all. Ua Palya. Kapina kinchuanu kun peyuna hunula ninuma kuna tamana kapu nulaye.
Thank you, Dr. Janara. Thank you very much. And thank you to the participants. Some of the learning materials will be provided by the conference organisers to those who have attended, who are interested. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Suresh, Dr. Awad, and thank you, Tiano. And thank you for listening deeply to the messages in the session. We hope it's given you food for thought for continuing the work of an Indigenous Global Greens network. We've come close to time, but if there were any burning questions, the speakers have their profiles and will be at other sessions and are also contactable, obviously, after this online conference to continue the work of forming an Indigenous Global Greens network. You can get their contacts, as I've seen in the chat, some questions. How do we get in touch with the speakers? Their profiles are on the Hoover app. If you can't find them there, then we're happy for you to contact us directly and the conference organisers, and we will put you in touch with the people who can answer the questions you've raised and continue these discussions we have as Greens. So thank you for attending. Thank you for participation. And we hope you've got a knowledge as well as a cultural blessing from this session. And we hope to see you at other Greens conferences and continue the yarn. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Janara.
Thank you, Dominic, for being
Thank
the
you.
deadliest chair.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Diana. Kia ora.
Kia
Thank you
ora.
all. Bye-bye.
Talia.
Bye, Dr. Awad.
Bye, Suresh. Bye, Dr. Ahmad.
Thank you, Nick.